This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. I want to start with a woman nobody is worried about. Not the woman people whisper about. Not the woman whose life has already fallen apart in public. Not the woman standing in the ruins, obvious and undeniable, asking to be saved. I want to start with the woman everyone trusts. The woman everyone depends on. The woman who still shows up with her lipstick on, her bills paid, her children fed, her texts answered, her calendar color-coded, her smile ready at the door before anyone can ask a second question. I want to start with the woman who looks so fine from the outside that nobody thinks to ask whether she is disappearing inside her own life. Because some of the loneliest women in the world are not alone. Some of them are married. Some of them are sitting at kitchen islands under warm pendant lights in quiet suburban homes, folding school uniforms, replying to a work email, thawing tomorrow's chicken, and wondering why the life they built with such care feels like a room with no oxygen in it. Some of them are lying beside a man who has not really seen them in years. Some of them are not being screamed at. Not being hit. Not being publicly humiliated. And that is exactly why their pain becomes so hard to explain. There is no obvious crime scene. Only a woman whose soul has gone dim in a house that still looks beautiful at Christmas. If that kind of truth is what you come here for, subscribe to the channel and stay with me. This space is for the stories that rarely get said out loud, the ones women carry in silence for years. And if these words feel uncomfortably familiar, then you are exactly who I am speaking to. I think one of the most unsettling things about marriage is how easy it can be to lose myself without any single dramatic moment announcing that I am gone. It does not always happen in one betrayal. It does not always happen in one cruel sentence, one slammed door, one affair, one final fight. Sometimes it happens in ordinary light. In repetition. In slow erosion. In 1,000 small moments that seem too minor to name on their own, but together become a life I no longer recognize as mine. That is what I think people miss when they talk about women who feel trapped in marriage. They imagine a cage. But sometimes the trap is continuity. Sometimes the trap is that nothing is bad enough to justify the depth of what I feel, and yet everything is heavy enough to flatten me over time. I am still functioning. That is the part that confuses everybody. I still remember the pediatrician's office hours. I still know where the extra batteries are. I still bring the right dish to the school potluck. I still answer, "We're good," when somebody asks how things are going. I still buy the birthday card for his mother. I still remember that our daughter needs poster board by Thursday and that the dog's medication is almost out and that our son gets quiet when something is bothering him and that the pantry needs olive oil and that my husband said he would call the plumber but forgot again. I still carry the world. So how could I possibly be the one who is falling apart? That is the real mystery, isn't it? How does a woman become invisible in a life that rests so heavily on her presence? How does a woman become lonely in rooms where her name is spoken all day? How does a woman become emotionally homeless inside the very life she spent years helping build? I think it begins with a role. A role I am praised for playing well. The dependable one. The calm one. The mature one. The one who keeps things moving. The one who does not make things harder than they already are. The one who can be counted on. The one who knows what everyone needs before they ask. The one who absorbs disappointment without dropping the ball. The one who can take a little more. Then a little more. Then a little more. And because I play that role so well, nobody notices when it stops being strength and starts becoming disappearance. That is the kind of pain I want to talk about. Not the loud kind. The polished kind. The pain of being needed everywhere and known nowhere. The pain of being appreciated for what I do, while feeling less and less connected to who I am. The pain of hearing people say, "You have such a beautiful life," while I am privately trying to remember the last time I felt fully alive inside it. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs to women like this. Women who are not in flames, but are burning anyway. Women who are not collapsing, but have been carrying too much for too long. Women who are not unloved in the obvious ways, but who have gone years without feeling deeply accompanied. Women who cannot point to one spectacular wound, only 1,000 private absences. No one tells us that this kind of marriage exists. A marriage where the bills are paid, the children are mostly fine, the husband is decent enough in public, the photos look normal, the holidays still happen, and yet something in me keeps going quiet. A marriage where I am not exactly miserable every minute, but I am no longer at home inside myself. A marriage where I am touched but not reached. A marriage where I am thanked, but not deeply known. A marriage where I matter tremendously to the functioning of the household, but less and less to the emotional truth of it. That is a devastating thing to realize. Because once I see it, I cannot unsee it. Once I notice that my life depends on me but does not hold me, something changes. I begin to understand why so many women feel trapped without having the language for it. It is not always because they are physically unable to leave. Sometimes it is because they cannot even explain what is missing without sounding ungrateful. Sometimes it is because emotional neglect leaves no visible bruise. Sometimes it is because the better I perform, the less believable my sorrow becomes. Sometimes it is because I have spent so many years being fine that I no longer know how to say I am not. And maybe the most frightening part is this: by the time a woman begins asking herself what happened to her, the disappearance did not begin yesterday. It began years earlier. It began in the moments she swallowed what hurt. It began in the moments she chose peace over truth. It began in the moments she made herself smaller to keep the atmosphere stable. It began in the moments she confused endurance with love. That is why this story matters. Because before a woman asks, "Should I leave?" there is usually another question living underneath it. A quieter question. A sadder one. When did I become this far away from myself? That is the question I want to follow. Not just to the edge of marriage, but back to the beginning of the silence. Because the woman everyone thinks is fine is often the woman carrying the heaviest secret of all. She did not vanish all at once. She vanished in plain sight. I knew something was wrong long before I had the courage to name it. There is a kind of knowing that does not arrive as a sentence. It arrives as tension, as hesitation, as that strange feeling in my chest when everyone around me seems more certain than I am. I think that is one of the hardest truths for many women to admit. I often knew something was wrong long before I had the courage to call it wrong. Not because I was foolish. Not because I was blind. But because there is a difference between sensing danger and being ready to rearrange my life around what I sense. A lot of us are taught to distrust the earliest version of our own knowing. We are taught to call it fear. We are taught to call it immaturity. We are taught to call it cold feet, overthinking, anxiety, unrealistic standards, commitment issues, or selfishness. Almost anything except wisdom. So when something inside me pulls back, I do not always honor it. I negotiate with it. I try to soften it into something more socially acceptable. I tell myself that love is supposed to be hard in the beginning. I tell myself that nobody gets everything they want. I tell myself that chemistry matters less than commitment, that stability matters more than instinct, that a good man is not always an emotionally fluent man, that maybe what I am feeling is simply the discomfort of growing up. But the body is often honest before the mind can afford to be. I think back to the years when my future still looked wide open. I had choices then. Real choices. Places I could have gone, degrees I could have pursued, cities I could have moved to, identities I could have stepped into before I became attached to the role of someone's wife. I remember standing in the doorway of that version of my life and hesitating, not because I lacked ambition, but because ambition can feel lonely when marriage is being held up as the more beautiful story. That is another thing women rarely say out loud. Sometimes I do not say yes because I am deeply certain. Sometimes I say yes because the alternative is too large, too undefined, too far away from the life everyone else seems to understand. Marriage can look like love, but it can also look like relief. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from explaining myself. Relief from being the woman who is still deciding. And once that relief gets mixed in with love, it becomes harder to tell what I am really choosing. I remember the season before the wedding, and how nobody would have looked at me and thought, she is grieving. I looked normal. I smiled in the right places. I answered the questions. I tried on dresses. I nodded through conversations about flowers, venues, timelines, guest counts, invitations. Everything on the outside had the polished rhythm of a life moving forward. But privately, I was already bargaining with myself. That is the part one thinks matters most. I was not standing at the edge of marriage asking, is this right? I was standing there asking, can I live with what feels wrong? Those are not the same question. One question protects my future. The other prepares me to endure it. And I think that is where many women lose ourselves before the marriage even begins. Not in one dramatic act of betrayal, but in the quiet decision to become more flexible than truthful, more agreeable than honest, more committed to preserving the dream than listening to the part of me that is not at peace. I have often wondered how many women knew on the day they got engaged that something inside them had gone still. Not loud, just still. How many women looked at a ring and felt not only joy, but also a flicker of mourning they could not explain? How many women knew, even then, that they were already compromising on something they would later spend years trying to recover? Sometimes what I knew was not even about one terrible event. It was subtler than that. It was in what did not happen, in what was missing, in what was never asked, in what did not feel held with enough care, in how quickly the shape of my life began to organize itself around someone else's comfort while I was still calling that devotion. There are moments that return to me now with almost unbearable clarity. The night of an engagement. The drive home after. The silence in the house. The way a parent looked at me and asked one simple question that landed harder than a speech ever could. Are you sure? That question can split a life in two. Because if I am already unsettled, a question like that does not create doubt. It reveals it. And still, many women do what I did. We answer too quickly. We answer with the version of ourselves that needs certainty to be true because too much is already in motion. We answer with pride, with defensiveness, with the stubbornness that rises when somebody gets too close to the truth before I am ready to face it myself. Yes, I'm sure. Sometimes that sentence is not conviction. Sometimes it is panic in a nicer dress. What hurts me now is not just that I moved forward. It is how many pieces of myself I abandoned in order to do it. I abandoned curiosity. I abandoned hesitation. I abandoned the right to admit I was unconvinced. I abandoned the part of me that still wanted a larger life, a harder life maybe, but a true one. And once I crossed that threshold, I started calling self-betrayal maturity. That is how it happens for a lot of women. I do not enter marriage believing I am betraying myself. I tell myself I am compromising. I tell myself this is adulthood. I tell myself everybody gives something up. I tell myself all marriages require adjustment. I tell myself love means staying open even when I feel uncertain. But uncertainty has texture. There is a difference between normal fear and deep misalignment. One trembles because life is changing. The other trembles because something sacred inside me already knows I am crossing against myself. The tragedy is that women are often highly skilled at rationalizing what hurts us early. Especially smart women. Especially capable women. Especially women who have spent their lives being praised for how well we adapt. We do not always collapse when something feels wrong. We become articulate. We explain it. We contextualize it. We make it make sense. Maybe I am just scared to move. Maybe I am just overwhelmed. Maybe I am comparing him to a fantasy. Maybe this is my last chance. Maybe I have already invested too much to walk away now. That last one is deadly. Time is one of the most persuasive lies in the world. The longer I have loved someone, the more impossible it can feel to admit that the length of the story does not guarantee its truth. Years can become their own argument. I have known him this long. We have come this far. I cannot let all of that mean nothing. But staying with something because it has lasted is not the same as staying because it is alive. Sometimes history becomes a trap disguised as loyalty. Sometimes fear of wasting years makes me willing to waste more. And then there is the social ache of it all. The age when other women around me are getting married, nesting, moving forward into recognizable adulthood. The pressure of feeling left behind. The pressure of feeling chosen before time runs out. The pressure of imagining that if I do not do it now, nobody else will ever come. Those pressures do not always sound dramatic, but they can be powerful enough to make a woman distrust her own interior truth. That is why I think so many women look back later and say the same painful thing in different words. I knew. I knew, but I did not trust myself enough. I knew, but I was not ready to disappoint anyone. I knew, but I was more afraid of uncertainty than I was of loneliness. I knew, but I kept hoping certainty would come after the ceremony. And maybe that is the saddest part. Not that I had doubts. Doubts are human. It is that I kept expecting the marriage to heal the fracture that began before it. But the things I refused to name at the beginning do not disappear. They wait. They grow roots in silence. And years later, when I finally find the courage to tell the truth, it does not feel like discovering something new. It feels like meeting something that has been waiting for me all along. The invisible job I could never clock out of. There is a kind of work that almost never gets counted because nothing in the culture knows how to measure it correctly. It does not leave with me when I leave the office. It does not fit neatly into a job title. It does not generate praise proportional to the energy it consumes. Most of the time, it is not even visible enough to be recognized as work at all. It lives in memory, anticipation, emotional regulation, quiet vigilance, and the exhausting habit of thinking for everyone before they have to think for themselves. That was the job I could never clock out of. And the reason it was so hard to explain is because from the outside, it looked like I was simply good at life. I remembered things. I kept things moving. I noticed what other people missed. I knew when the milk was low before anyone opened the fridge. I knew when a child's mood had shifted before anyone else heard the silence in it. I knew when a doctor's appointment needed to be made, when a school form was due, when a birthday was coming, when the dog's medication had to be refilled, when the pantry needed restocking, when the family calendar was about to collapse into overlap and chaos. None of that sounds dramatic when I say it quickly. That is part of the problem. Because the invisible job is built out of things that sound small until they never stop. What wore me down was not one grand burden. It was the constant state of being mentally on call. Even when I was sitting down, part of me was still standing. Even when I was technically resting, some part of my mind was scanning ahead. Tomorrow's lunch. Next week's schedule. The permission slip. The prescription refill. The gift I still needed to buy. The call that hadn't been returned. The conversation that needed to happen. The thing nobody else noticed but that would somehow become my emergency if I ignored it too long. That is what people miss when they talk about how much married women carry. They imagine labor as something visible. Something with a beginning and an end. But this kind of labor is atmospheric. It is not just what I do. It is what I have to keep holding in my head so that other people can keep moving through their lives as if things naturally run themselves. I became the unseen operating system of the home. Not just the one doing tasks. The one remembering that the tasks existed. That difference matters more than most people understand. Because there is a deep exhaustion that comes from being the person who must always remain mentally available to what is coming next. If I only cooked dinner, that would be one thing. But dinner was never only dinner. Dinner was what needed to be thawed, what was already in the fridge, who had soccer practice, whether there was enough time before pickup, whether somebody had a food sensitivity that day, whether there would be leftovers for tomorrow, whether I needed to stop by the store, whether the dishwasher had been emptied, whether the kitchen would be destroyed again afterward, whether I had enough energy to care. Nothing arrived one at a time. Everything arrived stacked. And when a life is built that way for long enough, I stop feeling like a woman inside a marriage and start feeling like a central processing unit. Useful. Necessary. Overheated. There is something especially lonely about how invisible that kind of labor becomes when I do it well. If I remember everything, no one sees the cost of remembering. If I solve problems before they become problems, then from the outside it looks like there were never any problems to begin with. If birthdays happen, clothes get washed, forms get signed, appointments get made, plans come together, and children arrive where they need to be on time with what they need, then the illusion is that life is simply functioning. But what people call life functioning is often a woman preventing collapse in real time. And because I was good at it, it became natural to expect more of me. That is one of the quietest ways resentment is born. Not because I hated caring. Not because I resented every responsibility. But because there is a painful difference between participating in a shared life and becoming the default manager of everyone else's existence. When that line blurs, marriage stops feeling mutual. It starts feeling like a structure organized around my capacity to compensate. And the hardest part was knowing that the man beside me was not incapable. I think women are expected to soften this truth because it sounds too sharp when spoken plainly. But plain truth has its own dignity. I had watched him be competent in the world. I had watched him solve problems at work, answer difficult emails, navigate pressure, manage deadlines, make decisions, anticipate consequences, show initiative, carry responsibility when it mattered to him. So when that same man came home and seemed unable to notice what needed doing unless it was spoken, repeated, outlined, and handed to him in pieces, it did something to me that was deeper than irritation. It made me feel alone. Because helplessness is a very different thing when it is selective. I could have survived more shared exhaustion. What hollowed me out was the private knowledge that home did not command the same seriousness from him that work did. The family did not receive his most attentive self by default. The emotional and logistical life of the household was treated like something that would absorb itself unless I stepped in. And when I stepped in often enough, that became the order of things. He did not always have to remember because I remembered. He did not always have to think ahead because I thought ahead. He did not always have to feel the consequences immediately because I intercepted them first. That is how a woman becomes indispensable and invisible at the same time. The world often calls this love, or partnership, or motherhood, or just what women do. But there are days when I think the better word is overextension. Not because the work itself is beneath me, but because it consumes more than time. It consumes interior space. It fills the corners of my mind that used to belong to spontaneity, desire, creativity, stillness. It leaves me physically present and psychically dispersed. I may be sitting at a dinner table, But inside I am already in tomorrow morning, next month's payment, the school email I forgot to answer, the aging parent I need to check on, the birthday cake I still need to order. That kind of split erodes something intimate. Not just romance. Presence. It is hard to feel connected to anyone when my mind is a crowded hallway full of unfinished reminders. It is hard to feel softness when I am carrying the weight of constant anticipation. It is hard to want tenderness from someone when I experience them mostly as another person whose needs eventually land in my mental inbox. And then comes the cruelest twist of all. The more exhausted I become, the less graceful I appear. I become shorter in tone, less patient, more forgetful in small ways because my mind is overloaded, more emotionally flat because all my energy is going toward maintenance. And then sometimes the very labor that drained me gets used as evidence that I am the problem. That I am too stressed, too controlling, too tense, too hard to please. But what if I was not controlling? What if I was compensating for chronic underresponsibility? What if I was not anxious by nature, but living in a system that taught me nothing would hold unless I held it? I think that is why this invisible job is so spiritually exhausting. It does not just ask for effort. It alters identity. It slowly teaches me that my value lies in preventing friction, absorbing consequences, staying alert, and carrying what would otherwise fall apart. And if I do that long enough, I stop asking whether I am loved well. I start asking whether everyone else is okay. That is the danger. Because the moment a woman becomes more responsible for the functioning of the marriage than for the truth of her own inner life, something sacred begins to go missing. Not all at once. Just steadily enough that one day she wakes up and realizes she has not had a true day off in years. Not from chores. From vigilance. And there is no time card in the world that can show what that costs. I was needed for what I did, not cherished for who I was. There is a particular kind of grief that does not begin when love disappears. It begins when I realize that the marriage still has a place for my labor, my patience, my steadiness, my problem-solving, my caregiving, my emotional maturity, my willingness to keep going, but less and less room for me. That is a devastating distinction. Because for a long time, being needed can feel almost identical to being loved. If everyone depends on me, if the household leans on me, if my absence would be felt immediately, then surely I matter here. Surely that means I am precious. Surely that means I am held in some deep and meaningful way. But dependence can be a poor imitation of tenderness. A woman can be essential to the machinery of a marriage and still feel profoundly unloved inside it. I did not understand that at first. I thought the exhaustion was simply part of adulthood, part of marriage, part of motherhood, part of being the strong one. I told myself that love changes shape over time, that romance settles into partnership, that real life is made of responsibilities and not feelings. I told myself all the mature things women say when we are trying to survive on less than we need. But beneath those explanations, something quieter and more painful was taking shape. I was becoming valuable for what I absorbed, not cherished for who I was. There is a difference between being chosen and being assigned. A difference between being adored and being relied upon. A difference between being loved as a person and being preserved as a function. And once I felt that difference, I could not unknow it. I think this happens to many women gradually. Not through one cruel sentence, though sometimes there are those too. Not through one dramatic betrayal. It happens through repetition. Through the slow arrangement of a life in which I become the one who will handle it. Whatever it is. The children's emotional needs. The aging parent. The social calendar. The holiday meals. The difficult phone call. The family tension. The illness. The recovery. The disappointment. The mess after the mess. I become the one who can be counted on not to collapse. The one who will translate everyone's needs into action. The one who will keep the atmosphere from breaking apart. And the more I do this, the more natural it becomes for everyone else to assume I will continue. That is how a woman becomes central and invisible at the same time. My presence is required everywhere, yet my inner life becomes strangely optional. People know what I do. They do not always know what it costs me. They know I am competent. They do not always ask whether I am lonely. They know I can handle things. They do not always wonder whether I am being handled with care. That is the ache at the center of this kind of marriage. I am not entirely neglected in the obvious sense. I am consulted, needed, reached for, expected. But all of that can still leave a woman emotionally starving if the relationship only knows how to value what she provides. I have seen how this happens in ways that are easy to romanticize from the outside. A woman caring for a sick family member because she is so nurturing. A wife absorbing the emotional instability of a husband because she is so patient. A mother carrying the practical burden of everyone's life because she is so organized. A spouse making endless allowances for another person's grief, addiction, ambition, or avoidance because she is so understanding. But admiration can hide exploitation when no one is asking what that understanding has required me to sacrifice. There is a point where caregiving stops feeling like generosity and starts feeling like erasure. And women are often the last ones allowed to say that out loud. Because resentment in a woman who gives a lot is treated almost like a moral failure. If I am tired of carrying too much, I am told to rest, but not to question why so much has landed on me in the first place. If I feel depleted, I am encouraged to take care of myself, but not always invited to tell the truth about the relationship structure that made self-care feel like a bandage over a broken bone. If I admit that I feel used, the room gets uncomfortable, because used sounds too harsh for a marriage that still looks respectable. But sometimes harsh language is the most honest language available. There were moments when I could feel, with painful clarity, that I was wanted most when I was useful. When I was smoothing conflict, arranging life, stabilizing the house, buffering his moods, carrying emotional weight without complaint, showing up with practical love that asked for little in return. But the moment I needed something less efficient, comfort, softness, patience, curiosity, emotional presence, the kind of care that cannot be scheduled or outsourced, the response changed. The warmth thinned. The attention faltered. The room lost interest. That is when the truth became impossible to avoid. I was not always being met as a person. I was often being managed as a resource. And that realization does something deep to a woman. It changes how touch feels. It changes how silence feels. It changes the mirror. It changes the body. Because the body understands when it is being approached as a place of access rather than a place of reverence. The body understands when it is tired beyond language. When desire has gone dull not because love is impossible, but because life has become too extractive. When even rest feels incomplete because I know somebody will need something the moment I soften. I think that is part of why so many women begin to feel emotionally brittle in marriages like this. Not because we are cold. Not because we are incapable of love. But because a person cannot live indefinitely in a condition where she is continually drawn from and rarely replenished. Eventually the inner world starts protecting itself. A woman becomes more guarded, more inward, less spontaneous, more careful with her energy, more reluctant to offer what has so often been taken for granted. Then comes the guilt. Because many women do not only feel lonely in this dynamic. We feel ashamed for feeling lonely. Ashamed that being needed no longer feels flattering. Ashamed that generosity has started to feel heavy. Ashamed that resentment appears in the middle of caregiving. Ashamed that we are no longer able to romanticize sacrifice the way we once did. But resentment is often not cruelty. Sometimes it is grief with heat in it. Grief that I have given from the deepest places in me and still feel unseen. Grief that my tenderness has been treated as renewable when it is not. Grief that I kept confusing endurance with intimacy. I think what makes this especially painful is that being needed can create the illusion of closeness. If someone depends on me, I may feel irreplaceable. But irreplaceable is not the same as cherished. A housekeeper can be irreplaceable. A caregiver can be irreplaceable. An assistant can be irreplaceable. A woman can become utterly indispensable to a system that still does not know how to love her well. Cherishing is different. Cherishing notices me before I am at the point of depletion. Cherishing cares how life feels inside my body, not just how well I keep life running for everyone else. Cherishing does not assume that because I have been strong, I must therefore require less. Cherishing is not impressed by my ability to carry pain quietly. It wants to know why I have had to. And once I began to understand that, I also began to understand why so many women feel a strange and private sorrow inside marriages that are still functioning. Because functioning can hide a profound emotional imbalance. A marriage can still stand while one person is slowly being reduced to role, labor, stability, and service. I do not think most women are longing for perfection. I think many of us are longing to be encountered. Not thanked in passing. Not admired for resilience. Not depended on for competence. Encountered. To be felt as fully human. To be asked about the life inside us. To be loved in ways that do not begin with our usefulness. To be held as women, not merely as wives who keep the lights on emotionally. A woman can survive a long time on being needed. But somewhere along the way, survival stops being enough. Because the soul knows the difference between being important to a life and being precious within it. The marriage that looked beautiful in public. There is a special kind of loneliness that comes from standing inside a marriage the world keeps calling beautiful. I do not mean beautiful in the grand, cinematic way. I mean polished, presentable, persuasive. The kind of marriage that photographs well. The kind that makes sense to other people. The kind that gathers compliments in small, ordinary moments until even I begin to feel guilty for the ache I carry inside it. That kind of marriage can be one of the hardest places for a woman to tell the truth. Because if the outside of a life keeps being admired, the inside of it begins to feel less believable, even to the woman living there. That is what I think people rarely understand. A marriage does not have to look broken in public to be breaking a woman in private. Sometimes the marriage that wounds me most deeply is the one everyone thinks I should be grateful for. The one other women call stable. The one relatives describe as solid. The one friends gesture toward when they say, "At least you have a good man." At least. That phrase can silence a woman for years. At least he provides. At least he comes home. At least he is not like other men. At least he remembers birthdays. At least he shows up at events. At least he posts about you. At least he looks proud to be your husband. People do not understand that at least can become a prison. Because once a marriage has enough visible goodness to make everyone comfortable, my quieter suffering starts to sound petty, indulgent, even disloyal. It becomes harder to say, "I know what this looks like, but I am still lonely here." Harder to say, "Yes, he is charming, but I do not feel safe in the places that matter." Harder to say, "Yes, he knows how to look attentive, but I cannot remember the last time I felt deeply accompanied by him when no one else was watching." That is the split I want to name. There is the marriage as it is seen. And there is the marriage as it is lived. Those two things are not always the same. Sometimes they are not even close. I know what it is like to be next to a man in public and feel the world reading him as warmth while I am standing there carrying the memory of his coldness. I know what it is like to watch him become more tender the moment other people enter the room. To hear the softness in his voice sharpen only when we are alone again. To see him perform care with such precision that I begin wondering whether the version of him that hurts me is somehow less real than the one everyone else gets to enjoy. That kind of contradiction does something dangerous to a woman's mind. It makes me doubt my own experience. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But slowly, in tiny humiliating ways. I begin editing my own reactions before I even speak. I begin telling the story from his angle first, so I will sound fair. I begin minimizing what wounded me because I know how it will sound beside all the evidence of his public goodness. The flowers. The vacation photos. The social ease. The dinner party charisma. The way he can make a room laugh. The way he can sound supportive in front of other people. The way strangers, friends, family, even my own children sometimes, can look at him and see a version of the marriage I keep failing to feel. That is what makes these marriages so psychologically exhausting. I am not only carrying pain. I am carrying contradiction. I am carrying the burden of knowing something the room does not know. And after enough years of that, the room starts winning. Not because it is right. Because it is louder. A public image can become a kind of pressure system. Once enough people admire the marriage, I begin feeling responsible for preserving not only the relationship, but the meaning other people have attached to it. Their reassurance becomes part of the architecture. Their compliments become another layer of the wall I have to climb over if I ever want to tell the truth. And social media made this worse in ways I do not think we are honest enough about. There was a time when a marriage only had to perform in a few physical places. Holidays. Church. Family dinners. Work events. School functions. Now it can perform all the time. In photos. In captions. In anniversary tributes. In vacation videos. In carefully framed moments that suggest intimacy without ever having to prove it. A smiling picture can erase a week of silence. A loving caption can make me feel ashamed for the emptiness I felt 10 minutes before it was posted. A man who knows how to curate the appearance of devotion can become nearly untouchable in the eyes of other people. And what happens to the woman living inside that image is almost never discussed. She becomes divided. There is the woman in the picture, and there is the woman who was crying before the picture. There is the woman people think they know, and there is the woman who feels herself becoming a stranger in her own home. There is the marriage that gets documented, and there is the marriage that gets survived. This is why I believe beautiful-looking marriages can be some of the loneliest places in the world. Because they do not only deprive a woman of closeness. They deprive her of credibility. The more polished the image, the more unbelievable her sadness becomes. And if her sadness becomes unbelievable to others for long enough, it starts becoming difficult for her to hold on to it herself without shame. Maybe I am asking for too much. Maybe this is simply what marriage becomes over time. Maybe everyone feels this way and just handles it better. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I focus too much on what is missing. Maybe I should be more grateful. That is how self-erasure learns to sound mature. I think one of the cruelest things about this kind of marriage is that it teaches a woman to distrust pain that cannot be displayed cleanly. If there is no obvious affair, no public scandal, no catastrophic scene, then what exactly am I allowed to grieve? If the man still appears decent, still knows how to be charming, still offers enough evidence of visible effort to keep everyone reassured, then what do I do with the private chill of being emotionally unseen? That chill matters. It matters that I feel more managed than met. It matters that my joy feels tolerated rather than shared. It matters that my pain is often received as inconvenience. It matters that I can spend an evening with someone and still feel profoundly alone beside him. It matters that a man can know how to be impressive without knowing how to be intimate. Those are not small things. They are not minor emotional luxuries. They are the difference between being in a relationship and simply maintaining one. And maybe that is what makes these marriages so haunting. They can remain socially intact while becoming spiritually empty. They can continue functioning long after tenderness has left the room. They can still produce holidays, routines, photographs, shared calendars, financial plans, and decent small talk while the woman inside them slowly loses access to her own reality. Because reality is not only what can be proven publicly. Reality is also the feeling in my chest when the door closes and the performance ends. Reality is the way my body tightens in private even when everything looked lovely in public. Reality is the exhaustion of being married to someone who is easier to admire than to truly live with. Reality is how often I became more careful than free, more edited than spontaneous, more presentable than honest. A marriage can be beautiful in the eyes of the world and still leave a woman emotionally starving. That is the truth people do not like because it disturbs the comfort of appearances. It asks us to consider that a man can look loving and still leave his wife profoundly alone. That a marriage can be aesthetically successful and emotionally barren. That public beauty can sometimes become the very thing that keeps a woman trapped inside private sorrow. And once I understood that, I also understood why it took me so long to say any of this out loud. Because sometimes the hardest marriage to question is the one everyone keeps applauding. My body knew before my mouth could say it. There came a point when my body began telling the truth faster than my mind could edit it. That was one of the most unsettling parts of the whole experience. I could still explain things. I could still contextualize them, soften them, place them inside a larger story about stress, marriage, children, timing, personality, miscommunication, exhaustion, seasons of life. I could still make the situation sound survivable in language. But my body had stopped cooperating with the version of the story that sounded reasonable. It knew before I could say it. It knew in the way my shoulders hardened before I heard his key in the door. It knew in the way my stomach dropped over small things that should not have felt so heavy. It knew in the strange fatigue that sleep did not fix. It knew in the way silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt loaded. I think women are often taught to distrust the body when it starts speaking in whispers. We trust visible evidence more than internal evidence. We trust what can be explained, documented, proven, named in a clean sentence. But the body does not usually begin with a speech. It begins with a flinch, a tightening, a shallow breath, a low hum of dread that follows me through ordinary moments until ordinary moments no longer feel ordinary. I did not wake up one morning with a revelation. I woke up many mornings feeling tired in a way that did not match my schedule. Tense in a way that did not match the conversation we had the night before. Sad in a way that did not seem dramatic enough to honor. The body can carry knowledge long before the conscious mind is willing to rearrange life around that knowledge. That is why so many women say things like, "I don't know why I'm crying all the time," or "I feel off," or "I'm just exhausted," when what they are really describing is a nervous system that has been trying to absorb emotional reality in silence. My body began keeping score in private places. In grocery store parking lots, where I would sit for a few extra minutes because I needed the stillness before walking back into my life. In the bathroom mirror, where my face started looking less like age and more like wear. In the car, where I no longer sang along to songs I used to love because there was always too much happening inside me. In bed, where I could feel tired to the bone and still struggle to drop fully into sleep. In the way I braced without realizing I was bracing. That word matters to me now. Brace. Because I think there are many marriages where a woman's body learns to brace long before she ever uses words like unhappy, unsafe, neglected, done, or over. She braces for tone, for disappointment, for the possibility that a conversation will somehow become about her failure to say it perfectly. She braces for the emotional weather in the room. She braces for the possibility of being unseen yet again. She braces not always because something explosive is about to happen, but because she has lived too long in an atmosphere where her nervous system no longer expects ease. That is not small. It changes the whole texture of being alive. It changes how food tastes, how rest feels, how desire works, how much energy is left for joy. There were moments when I thought I was simply overwhelmed. Maybe I needed a weekend off. Maybe I needed more sleep. Maybe I needed a massage, a walk, better vitamins, less caffeine, more boundaries, a break from the children, a quiet room, more discipline around stress. Women are often handed these little explanations because they are easier than asking a harder question. What if the body is not malfunctioning? What if it is accurately responding to a life that has become emotionally unlivable? That possibility frightened me. Because once I considered it, too many things began making sense. The headaches, the numbness, the low-grade panic I could not quite justify. The way I felt lonely even in company. The way one dismissive sentence could land in me like a physical blow, not because I was fragile, but because it was never just one sentence. It carried the full weight of every other moment that had gone unnamed. That is the thing about the body. It does not only react to the present. It reacts to accumulation. A public moment can expose years of private truth. A small humiliation can split open a whole hidden landscape of knowing. A single evening can suddenly reveal what my body has been trying to tell me all along. Maybe that is why some women remember one very specific scene with such clarity. Not because that scene created the truth, but because it crystallized it. A man thanking everyone in the room except the wife who has been carrying more than anyone knows. A woman in physical pain still being treated like a machine that should continue functioning. A hotel room where, once no one needs anything from me, I collapse into a sleep so deep it feels less like rest and more like shutdown. A drive that was supposed to be temporary, only to realize halfway through that I cannot make myself turn around. These moments matter because the body recognizes finality before language catches up. It says, there. There it is. There is the thing I have been trying not to know. And often, the moment itself sounds too small when repeated aloud. That is part of what makes it so lonely. Other people hear the story and think, that was it. But women know better. It was never only that. It was the fact that my whole body recognized it. My whole body said yes, this is the shape of the truth. This is how little room I actually have here. This is what my place in this relationship has become. I think many women spend years trying to think their way out of what their bodies have already concluded. We gather context. We offer fairness. We analyze. We revise. We tell ourselves that strong women should be able to tolerate ambiguity. But the body is often less interested in ambiguity than the mind. It asks simpler questions. Can I rest here? Can I soften here? Can I tell the truth here? Can I be fully human here without being punished for it? When the answer to those questions becomes no for too long, the body begins to speak louder. Sometimes through illness. Sometimes through insomnia. Sometimes through dread. Sometimes through a flatness so deep that life starts to feel padded over, as if I am moving through it from behind glass. And still, many women keep going. We do not stop the first time the body protests. We adapt. That is what women do. We normalize what should alarm us. We call depletion normal. We call numbness a phase. We call emotional starvation stress. We become fluent in functioning while quietly leaving ourselves behind. But the body does not forget. It remembers every swallowed sentence, every swallowed cry, every time I had to make myself smaller to keep the room stable, every time I smiled while my spirit withdrew, every time I pretended I was only tired when I was actually grieving. That is why I do not dismiss bodily knowledge anymore. Because before I could say, "This marriage is hurting me," my body had already been saying it for years. Not in a dramatic voice, in a faithful one. And if I am honest, that may have been the most loving thing anyone was doing for me in that season. My body refused to let me disappear without a witness. Why I stayed even after the truth was obvious. By the time the truth became obvious, I wish I could say staying no longer made sense to me. But that would be a lie women tell when they want their story to sound cleaner than it was. The truth is, I often stayed long after my heart had stopped calling the marriage safe, not because I was confused about what was happening, but because leaving and knowing are not the same thing. Knowing is an interior event. Leaving is a social, financial, maternal, psychological, spiritual event. Knowing happens in silence. Leaving drags furniture, children, shame, history, family, money, memory, and identity into the room. So yes, I knew. And yes, I still stayed. That is the part people judge most easily when they have never had to live it. They assume staying means I had not seen clearly enough. They assume that if the pain was real, action would have followed quickly. But pain does not always produce motion. Sometimes it produces paralysis. Sometimes it produces endurance. Sometimes it produces a woman who can tell the truth privately while still being unable to reorganize her whole life around that truth. I stayed because my life was not made of feelings alone. It was made of children's routines, mortgage payments, family traditions, school years, holidays already planned, shared furniture, shared friends, and the unbearable thought of blowing up a world that, from the outside, still looked intact enough to protect. People say, you only get one life, and that may be true, but women with children know something else is also true. When I leave, it is not only my life that changes shape. It is theirs. Their bedrooms. Their mornings. Their holidays. Their understanding of home. Their idea of what love looks like, yes, but also their ordinary little rituals, the invisible choreography that makes childhood feel stable. So I stayed, in part, because mothers are asked to weigh unbearable things. I stayed because I could imagine my own loneliness more easily than I could imagine my children's confusion. I stayed because the prospect of sharing them, missing half their lives, becoming a weekend mother in certain seasons, or watching them absorb the fracture of a family felt like a pain I could not yet consent to. I stayed because women are often expected to calculate everybody's grief before honoring our own. And when a woman has spent years doing that, she does not suddenly become self-protective just because the truth is now clear. I stayed because shame has a heavier body than people admit. Not the shallow shame of embarrassment. The deeper kind. The kind that settles into identity. The kind that whispers, "So this is who you are now." The woman whose marriage did not make it. The woman who chose wrong. The woman who stayed too long. The woman who built a whole life around a promise that could not hold. There is a humiliation in that, not because divorce itself is shameful, but because so many women build their dignity around being competent, thoughtful, careful, mature, discerning. When the marriage begins to fail, it can feel like a referendum on my own judgment. As if the collapse is not only relational, but personal evidence that I misunderstood my own life. And shame makes strange bargains. It tells me that quiet suffering is more respectable than visible change. It tells me that private emptiness is preferable to public unraveling. It tells me that as long as I can keep functioning, maybe I can keep my image of myself intact too. I stayed because hope does not die when truth arrives. That may be one of the most humiliating realities of all. I did not stay because I still believed in a fairy tale. I stayed because hope can survive in thin, stubborn forms even after the larger dream has already failed. Hope says maybe this version of him is temporary. Hope says maybe this conversation will finally land. Hope says maybe therapy will name what I have been trying to name. Hope says maybe if I stop pushing, he will come toward me on his own. Hope says maybe grief is making him absent. Maybe work is making him brittle. Maybe time will soften him. Maybe age will humble him. Maybe if I become less reactive, more patient, more strategic, less disappointed, more forgiving, then the marriage will stop asking so much of me and begin giving something back. Hope can make a woman very loyal to her own suffering. Not because she enjoys it. Because she keeps imagining meaning on the other side of it. I stayed because I understood him too well. That is another truth women do not always say aloud because it sounds like weakness when it is really a form of misdirected compassion. I could see his wounds. I could see his fear. I could see the places where his pride was stitched over injury, where his distance was stitched over insecurity, where his anger was stitched over inadequacy, where his emotional limits had old roots. And because I could see all of that, I often gave his brokenness more dignity than I gave my own pain. I kept translating him into a language that made him easier to stay with. He is stressed. He is ashamed. He does not know how. He had no model. He is trying in the only ways he knows. He is not cruel, just damaged. But the longer I translated him, the less fluent I became in myself. That is one of the hidden dangers of empathy. It can turn a woman into an interpreter of the man who is hurting her, until she becomes nearly illiterate in the language of her own sorrow. I stayed because of time. Years have gravity. Shared history has gravity. The longer a woman has loved, explained, hoped, invested, adapted, forgiven, and carried, the more impossible it can feel to admit that all of that effort may not lead where she once believed it would. Time becomes its own argument. I have given too much to leave now. I have explained too much, forgiven too much, waited too much, built too much. Surely all of that cannot be for nothing. But time can trap a woman just as powerfully as fear. Because once I have spent years trying to make something work, leaving can feel like declaring that my own endurance meant less than I needed it to mean. I stayed because I was still attached to the imagined version of my life. Not even always to him. To the life. To the shape of it. To the meaning I had assigned to it. To the self I had been trying to become inside it. Sometimes what a woman grieves most is not the man beside her, but the future she once thought that man represented. The marriage may already be hollow, but the dream attached to it still breathes. The family table. The shared old age. The idea of being chosen and kept and known over time. The sense that all the work was building toward something beautiful, something stable, something worthy of the years it took. Leaving meant more than leaving him. It meant admitting that the future I had been faithful to did not exist. That kind of truth takes time to survive. I stayed because my identity was still wrapped around staying. That may be the hardest sentence in this whole story. Some women do not remain because the marriage still fits. We remain because the role still does. The wife who keeps trying. The good woman. The loyal one. The mature one. The one who does not walk away lightly. The one who can carry complexity without collapsing into self-interest. The one who knows love requires sacrifice. Those identities can become so fused to my sense of self that leaving does not feel like freedom at first. It feels like amputation. Like I am not only losing a marriage, but losing the version of myself who knew how to exist inside it. So yes, I stayed after the truth was obvious. Not because I did not know better. Because knowing better and being ready are not the same thing. I stayed because fear is slow. Shame is sticky. Children make every choice sacred and cruel at the same time. Hope lingers where it should not. Compassion can become self-erasure. History can disguise itself as obligation. Identity can make endurance feel wholly long after it has become destructive. And sometimes, by the time a woman finally leaves, she is not leaving because the truth became clearer. She is leaving because the cost of continuing to live against that truth finally became heavier than all the reasons she once stayed. Leaving was not one big decision. It was 100 quiet ones. Leaving did not arrive in my life as a single brave moment. It did not begin with a packed suitcase by the door, a speech finally delivered, or a dramatic scene where everyone could point to the exact second my marriage ended. By the time I physically left, something quieter had already been happening inside me for a long time. I had been moving away in ways no one could see. Not because I was deceptive. Because some departures begin in silence long before they become visible in the world. That is what I wish more people understood. A woman does not always leave all at once. Sometimes she leaves in fragments. In private decisions so small they do not even look like decisions at first. A thought she does not dismiss. A sentence she writes in her notes app and cannot bring herself to delete. A question she starts asking that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. If I needed to go, what would I need? That question changed the atmosphere of my life. Until then, I had spent so much energy trying to survive the marriage that I had not allowed myself to imagine life outside it in any serious way. I knew how to endure. I knew how to explain, how to delay, how to soften, how to wait, how to absorb, how to keep the machine running one more day. But the moment I began asking what I would actually need in order to leave, something inside me shifted. I stopped organizing my inner life around his understanding. I started, however quietly, organizing it around my own reality. That was the first leaving. Not the kind anyone could see. The kind that happens when I stop asking, how do I make this bearable, and begin asking, what would it take for me to tell the truth with my life? The strange thing is that almost nothing about me looked different on the outside in that season. I was still making coffee in the morning. Still answering emails. Still standing in the kitchen talking about ordinary things in an ordinary voice. Still buying groceries, signing forms, making appointments, washing towels, responding to family group texts, showing up at school events, smiling in photographs when I had to. My life still wore the costume of continuity. But underneath that surface, another layer had begun. I started paying attention to practical things with a kind of seriousness that was new. Not because I wanted to become cold or strategic, but because I could feel the shape of dependence more clearly now. I needed to know where the documents were. The birth certificates. The insurance cards. The passwords I had always assumed I would simply have access to because we were a family. I needed to know which bills were tied to my name and which were not. Which accounts I could enter alone. Which numbers I did not actually know by heart. I noticed how much of a shared life can quietly become a structure one person understands less than she should. That kind of noticing is not glamorous. It does not feel like liberation. It feels lonely. Because I am still inside the marriage while preparing, in secret, for the possibility that I may have to survive outside it. There is something heartbreaking about making ordinary dinner while also thinking about whether I have copies of the right paperwork. About folding laundry while wondering what I would bring first if I only had a few minutes. About helping with homework while trying to imagine how children survive the first week after a mother changes the shape of home. Leaving, at that stage, did not feel powerful. It felt like carrying two lives in one body. The visible life I was still performing, and the invisible one I was quietly building enough courage to imagine. And it was not only logistics. It was emotional preparation too. I began speaking less, but not because I had less to say. I spoke less because something in me finally understood that not every truth becomes more true by being repeated to someone committed to not receiving it. I had spent years trying to explain the marriage to the marriage. Trying to translate pain into language gentle enough not to provoke defensiveness, clear enough to be understood, soft enough to still count as loving. But once leaving began in me, I stopped using my most tender energy that way. I stopped handing my inner life to a dynamic that kept returning it to me smaller, flatter, more distorted than it had been when I offered it. That was another quiet decision. To stop performing hope in every conversation. To stop dragging my heart back into rooms where it was no longer safe to arrive unguarded. To let silence become information instead of failure. Then there were the tiny acts nobody thinks count, but they do. Telling one trusted person more than I had told anyone else. Saving a little money. Keeping my phone charged more carefully than before. Paying attention to where my keys were. Driving with a full tank of gas. Screenshotting things I once would have dismissed. Writing down numbers in case I could not get to them later. These are such small acts, and yet each one says the same thing. I am beginning to believe my life may need me in a new way. That is what leaving really was for me. A slow transfer of loyalty. 4 years, my loyalty had gone toward preserving the marriage, protecting the family image, managing the emotional weather, carrying the burden of complexity, maintaining normalcy for everyone else. But in that hidden season, my loyalty began moving back toward something I had neglected for too long, my own sense of truth. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough that I started listening when my inner life said, "This cannot go on forever." What surprised me most was how contradictory the whole process felt. I thought that if I ever truly began to leave, I would feel only certainty. Instead, I felt grief and relief side by side. Panic and clarity side by side. I could know the marriage was no longer livable in the same breath that I mourned the familiar shape of my days. I could gather what I needed and still feel disloyal doing it. I could imagine peace and still ache for the version of home I had spent years trying to create. Leaving was not pure. It was complicated, human, trembling. There was nothing cinematic about it. It was made of grocery lists and dread. Of practical thinking interrupted by sudden waves of sorrow. Of needing to remember the children's dentist appointment while also facing the possibility that my whole life was changing. That is why I resist the way people romanticize departure. They imagine a woman finally choosing herself as if the whole thing comes wrapped in clean conviction. But sometimes leaving feels less like self-celebration and more like spiritual triage. Less like triumph and more like the first honest act after years of trying to survive dishonestly. It does not always feel good. It often feels devastating. Because even when a marriage has become unbearable, it is still full of objects, memories, routines, habits of speech, little rituals, ordinary tendernesses, and familiar corners that my body has lived inside for years. I was not only leaving pain. I was leaving a whole ecosystem of familiarity, and familiarity has a powerful hold even when it hurts. By the time I finally crossed the visible threshold, the real departure had already happened many times over. It happened each time I stopped dismissing what I knew. Each time I chose documentation over denial. Each time I admitted that my confusion was not a reason to remain indefinitely. Each time I stopped treating my suffering as something to manage and started treating it as something that mattered. Each time I gathered one more piece of a life I might need to stand inside alone. That is how I left. Not with one decision. With 100 quiet ones. And then one day, the quiet became a door. What died before the marriage officially ended? What died before the marriage officially ended was not only love. That would almost be easier to explain. People understand the idea of love fading. They understand distance, disappointment, incompatibility, betrayal. They understand a breaking point. They understand the visible end, the paperwork, the move, the announcement, the changed last name, the empty side of the closet. But what they do not often understand is the long private funeral that happens before any of that. The marriage can remain standing in every outward sense while something essential inside it has already gone quiet, then cold, then still. That is what happened to me. By the time anything changed on paper, I had already been mourning for a very long time. I think that is one of the loneliest parts of being a woman in a dying marriage. The grief begins while I am still performing normalcy. I am still buying groceries, still making appointments, still discussing schedules, still answering practical questions, still being called wife in public, still sleeping in the same house, maybe even the same bed, while inside me something is steadily withdrawing from the life I am still being asked to maintain. It is a strange kind of split. My body is present. My role is present. My obligations are present. But my hope is beginning to die in increments so small no one else can hear them. People often imagine that the end of a marriage is one decision. For many women, that is not true. The legal ending may come later, but the emotional ending often happens by accumulation. One ignored plea at a time. One circular argument at a time. One apology that changes nothing. One dismissal. One lonely holiday. One moment of needing tenderness and receiving irritation instead. One more day of managing the atmosphere while telling myself I can live like this a little longer. That is how something precious dies. Not always through violence. Sometimes through repetition. Sometimes through the unbearable dullness of being hurt in the same way for so long that the pain stops feeling sharp and starts feeling structural. That is when grief becomes difficult to detect, because it no longer looks dramatic. It starts looking like quiet detachment. Less arguing. Less explaining. Less reaching. Less expectation. I stopped bringing certain things to him because I already knew what it felt like for them to land nowhere. I stopped hoping he would be the first place I wanted to carry my joy. I stopped believing that if I could only phrase my sadness more carefully, more gently, more intelligently, more fairly, then he would finally understand what the marriage had become for me. That loss matters more than people realize. The day a woman no longer believes understanding is possible, something holy has already been buried. Because marriage is not sustained by love alone. It is sustained by the belief that my inner life can still arrive here and be met. When that belief dies, the relationship can remain intact in form while becoming emotionally posthumous in reality. It still has routines. It still has logistics. It still has social meaning. But it has lost the thing that made all of that feel alive. For me, one of the first things that died was anticipation. I no longer looked forward to being known. I no longer expected repair. I no longer imagined that the next season would reveal a truer version of us. That sounds like a small thing, but it is not. Anticipation is a form of life. It is the soul leaning forward. And when a woman stops leaning forward in her marriage, when she begins bracing instead of blooming, enduring instead of expecting, surviving instead of trusting, something inside her is already walking toward the exit long before she ever physically leaves. Then respect began to die. And I do not think we talk enough about that. Love can sometimes survive hardship. It can survive disappointment. It can even survive seasons of confusion. But respect is more fragile than people admit. Every time my pain was minimized, every time accountability was dodged, every time effort appeared only when consequences became real, every time I was expected to keep carrying the emotional burden while also pretending the burden was not that heavy, respect thinned out. Not all at once. Just enough each time that eventually I could feel the marriage losing weight in my hands. That is what many women mean when we say we grieved the relationship before we left it. We are grieving the loss of trust, the loss of admiration, the loss of innocence, the loss of the version of ourselves who still believed love would be enough to make truth possible. And what makes that grief especially cruel is that it happens in private. No one brings casseroles for the woman whose hope is dying slowly in her own kitchen. No one marks the date when she stops believing that this conversation will lead somewhere new. No one notices the exact moment she begins emotionally packing her life away while still standing there smiling at dinner. So by the time the official ending comes, people often misread her. They think she is cold because she is not dramatic enough. They think she is detached because she is not crying the right way. They think she moved on too fast because they do not realize she has been living in grief for years. But calm at the end is not always indifference. Sometimes it is exhaustion after a very long sorrow. Sometimes it is what a woman looks like after she has already cried in 100 private places no one else had access to. I cried while loading the dishwasher. I cried in the car after perfectly ordinary conversations. I cried over things that were not even about the marriage on the surface because grief had leaked into everything by then. I cried for the years I could not get back. I cried for how long I had kept trying. I cried because I knew that even if I left, there would be no triumphant feeling waiting for me on the other side. There would only be truth. And truth, when it arrives that late, is rarely glamorous. Still, something else began happening in the middle of that grief. Space. Very small at first. I began hearing my own thoughts again. Not the thoughts shaped around his moods, his explanations, his needs, his reactions, his timing. My thoughts. Uninterrupted. Unmanaged. Untranslate. I began noticing how much of my internal life had been organized around maintaining the marriage, and how strange it felt to encounter my own mind outside that structure. Then other small things returned. Appetite. Silence that did not feel threatening. A laugh that came out before I could monitor it. The simple pleasure of choosing how to spend an hour without anticipating emotional consequences. I do not mean I became instantly whole. I did not. Recovery is too tidy a word for what came next. It was not a makeover. It was not an awakening montage. It was not empowerment in the way people like to package women after loss. It was quieter than that. I went for walks and noticed I was no longer rehearsing arguments in my head. I sat alone with coffee and realized solitude did not feel as lonely as marriage had. I wandered through ordinary places and felt grief and relief occupying the same body at once. That duality surprised me. I thought if the marriage had died emotionally before it ended officially, then I should feel nothing at the end but numbness. But grief is not that clean. I was grieving him, grieving me, grieving the years, grieving the dream, grieving the self I had become in order to survive, and at the same time I was meeting parts of myself that had been waiting patiently under all that accommodation. Not a new self. A quieter, older one. The self who still liked slowness. Who still liked beauty without performance. Who still wanted a life that felt inhabitable from the inside. That is what died before the marriage officially ended. Hope, trust, respect, the fantasy of being fully met there, the version of love that asked me to keep sacrificing myself in exchange for possibility. And that is also what began to return before the marriage officially ended. Honesty. Not easy honesty. Not freeing honesty. Just the kind that finally stops lying about what is already gone. By the time the papers came, the deepest ending had already happened. What remained was not the beginning of grief. It was the naming of it. I was never broken. I was living in the middle. For a long time, I thought the deepest truth about my life was that I had failed to build the marriage I was supposed to build. I thought the story was about choosing wrong, staying too long, enduring too much, asking too much, hoping too long, shrinking too often, and waking up one day in a life that no longer felt like home. I thought the story was about loss. About the slow erosion of intimacy. About becoming the woman who kept everything running while quietly disappearing inside the very structure she was helping hold together. I thought the story was about how love can be mistaken for duty, how devotion can become self-erasure, how a woman can spend years being needed and still feel untouched in the places that matter most. And all of that is true. But it is not the deepest truth. The deepest truth is that I was never broken. I was living in the middle. I was living in that quiet, brutal, invisible middle that so many women know and so few know how to name. The middle between who I had been and who I was becoming. The middle between the life that looked intact from the outside and the life that was no longer habitable from the inside. The middle between seeing the truth and being able to live by it. The middle between grief and clarity. Between loyalty and self-betrayal. Between staying and leaving. Between being the woman everyone admired for her strength and being the woman who went to bed at night wondering when she had become a stranger to herself. That was the real story. Not that I was weak. Not that I was foolish. Not that I had been ruined by love. But that I had spent years trying to survive inside an in-between season and calling it my identity. When I look back now, I can see the whole arc more clearly. I can see the young woman who knew something was wrong before she had the courage to call it wrong. I can see how early I began negotiating against myself, softening my instincts, mistrusting my own hesitation, calling misalignment compromise because that sounded more mature. I can see the woman who became the invisible engine of the household, carrying calendars, moods, appointments, logistics, emotional labor, family continuity, and all the little unseen things that keep a life appearing seamless. I can see the wife who was praised for how much she could handle, then quietly starved by a marriage that knew how to rely on her far better than it knew how to cherish her. I can see how confusing it became when the marriage still looked beautiful in public. How easy it was to doubt myself when the image remained polished, when the world kept calling the life lovely, when appearances were constantly arguing against my private experience. I can see the body that knew before my mouth could say it, the body that grew tense, tired, brittle, watchful, the body that kept a faithful record of what I was still trying to explain away. I can see why I stayed after the truth was obvious. Not because I did not know better, but because children, shame, hope, history, and identity are heavy things. I can see how leaving was never one brave, clean act. It was 100 quiet permissions. 100 hidden shifts in loyalty. 100 moments of choosing not to abandon my own inner life quite so completely. And I can see what died before the marriage officially ended. Not only love, but trust. Not only trust, but anticipation. Not only anticipation, but the belief that if I just tried hard enough, the relationship would become a place where I too could rest. By the time the ending became visible, I had already been grieving for years. That is why this story matters to me. Because I know there are women listening who have been calling themselves broken when what they really are is in transition. Women who think they are numb, difficult, ungrateful, emotionally exhausted, too sensitive, too far gone, when in fact they are standing in the middle of a truth their old life can no longer contain. Women who are not having a dramatic breakdown, but who can feel, quietly and unmistakably, that the life they have been performing is no longer the life they can keep surviving inside. The lesson I take from this story is not that marriage is hopeless, or that leaving is the answer for everyone, or that women should stop loving deeply. The lesson is something quieter and more demanding than that. It is that I should never confuse my ability to endure a life with evidence that the life is nourishing me. That is the lesson I wish more women were given earlier. Just because I can carry it does not mean I was meant to. Just because I can explain it does not mean it is healthy. Just because I can survive inside a relationship does not mean the relationship is worthy of my continued self-abandonment. And in everyday life, that lesson becomes very practical. It means I have to listen differently to my own fatigue. Not just ask how to manage it, but ask what it is telling me. It means I have to notice where I am constantly over-functioning and call that what it is instead of dressing it up as love. It means I have to pay attention to whether I feel more guarded than free, more responsible than cherished, more useful than known. It means I have to stop waiting for collapse before I honor what feels wrong. It means I have to become honest about the cost of looking fine. For the woman listening right now, maybe the application is not dramatic. Maybe it begins smaller than that. Maybe it begins by telling yourself the truth in one unspectacular sentence. Maybe it begins by admitting that you are lonelier than you let anyone know. Maybe it begins by noticing how often your body tightens in your own home. Maybe it begins by asking whether the life everyone praises is also the life you can actually inhabit with dignity. Maybe it begins by understanding that the middle is not a personal failure. It is often the place where truth gathers enough strength to become visible. And maybe that is the mercy in all of this. That the middle, as painful as it is not meaningless. It is where the old story stops working. It is where performance begins to crack. It is where the woman underneath all the endurance starts to whisper that she is still here. So I do not want to end this story by pretending that every ending becomes beautiful, or that clarity erases grief, or that telling the truth immediately makes life simple. It does not. Sometimes truth makes life harder before it makes life cleaner. Sometimes the middle lasts longer than I want. Sometimes the only thing I can do is stop insulting myself for being there. That matters. Because a woman who is in the middle does not need more shame. She needs language. She needs honesty. She needs the dignity of recognizing that what looks like confusion may actually be the beginning of self-respect returning. And that is why I keep coming back to the same sentence, because it says in so few words what took this whole story to understand. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. Now I want to ask you a small question, and I really want you to answer it in the comments with just one letter. When a woman starts feeling emotionally lost in her marriage, what do you think hurts more? A. Feeling unseen by the person beside her. B. Feeling herself disappear little by little. Comment A or B. And if this story touched something real in you, I want to hear your perspective too. What do you think is the most painful part of staying too long in a life that no longer feels like your own? Share your thoughts in the comments so other women can read them too. And subscribe to the channel to support this space and help me keep making the kind of honest, quiet stories that so many women have been carrying alone.